The night security sweep of the residential administrative wing took 28 minutes if everything was correct, which Brynn had learned meant 28 minutes if nothing required additional attention, rather than 28 minutes if he moved efficiently. Because the difference between those two things was the difference between a sweep that was timed and a sweep that was done correctly, and the night rotation's senior officer, Sergeant Vel, had made clear in the first week that the sweep was done correctly, or it was done again. He had not done a sweep again. He had timed them between 26 and 31 minutes across 14 completions. The variation being the honest variation of a route that had 11 corridor sections and 4 secured access points and occasional incidental complexities. A door that had not been fully closed by the previous sweep's occupant and required closing. A corridor section where the light sensor had been glitching and needed manual assessment. The standard minor variations of a living building at 3 in the morning. The route was in his legs. This was how he thought of it, not automatic, which implied it operated without him, but in his legs, which meant it was below the level of active navigation, and was operating from the accumulated repetition of 14 completions while he was still present to the route, still looking at what the route produced rather than simply executing it. He had learned this distinction from a training instructor whose specific phrase had been, "The route being in your legs means you can give your attention to the corridor while your legs take care of the route. If the route is in your head, your attention is on the route and the corridor goes unattended." He was in corridor section 7 at the 22nd minute, which was where the route put him at 22 minutes if nothing had required additional attention in sections 1 through 6, and nothing had. Section 7 was a junction. The route turned left at the junction, continued 12 paces, and passed through the door at section 7's end, which gave access to the administrative records corridor that was section 8. He had passed through this junction 14 times. He turned left. He walked 12 paces. He reached the door. The door was the left door. He understood this at the moment he opened it, understood it with the specific clarity of spatial recognition that arrives a fraction of a second after the action it applies to, the understanding catching up to the body that had moved without sufficient verification. There were 2 doors at section 7's end, and he had taken the left one rather than the right one, and the left one opened into a room that was not on his route. He understood all of this in the door's first second of being open, which was the same second in which the room beyond the door registered in the full way of something his attention had been given to rather than something his route had anticipated. The room was lit, it was occupied, it contained 3 people. He had the route in his legs and his attention in the corridor, and his attention had, as his training instructor had described, the capacity to process what the corridor produced. And what the room beyond the wrong door produced was something his attention began processing immediately, and that his training began reaching for immediately. And what both of them were reaching for, in the first 2 seconds of the door being open, was the picture. The picture was assembling. The first element of the picture was the room itself, which was a secondary administrative meeting space. The kind of room the residential administrative wing had 6 of, all of them with the same spare furnishing and the same functional proportions, all of them used for the kind of administrative coordination that happened between the primary meeting space's formal sessions, and that didn't require the primary space's resources. He knew this room type. He had swept one of the other 5 in section 4. The second element was the quality of the room at 3 in the morning, which was wrong. Secondary administrative meeting spaces at 3 in the morning were empty. Their occupancy at 3 in the morning was not 0 probability. Emergency coordination happened. Late working sessions happened. The palace's operations did not fully stop at night. But the quality of occupancy at 3 in the morning had a character that distinguished emergency coordination from other kinds of occupancy, and the quality of occupancy in this room was not emergency coordination. He processed this before he processed the people, because the room's quality was the context for the people, and the context arrived faster than the detail. Then he processed the people. The senior Varath court official was at the room's far end, standing rather than sitting, in the specific position of someone who had been in a conversation, and whose position in the conversation was oriented toward the other two figures. Brynn did not recognize the name. He did not have the Varath court's senior personnel in his reliable memory, because 3 weeks was not enough time to build that memory, and the night rotation's briefing materials covered security protocols rather than political personnel. What he recognized was the quality, which was the quality of institutional authority, the specific bearing of someone who had been in a position of significant standing long enough that the standing had become the default condition rather than something being performed. He was older and had the long Varath ears in the position of focused engagement, and was dressed in the formal attire of a court official, which at 3 in the morning in an unscheduled secondary meeting room was the specific element of the picture that contributed to the wrong quality assessment. The external figure was next to the window, which was the room's darkest position, and which the external figure appeared to have chosen deliberately. The external quality was in the clothing, not palace staff, not commission personnel, not any category of the residential administrative wing's ordinary population. The clothing was correct enough to pass a visual check in a corridor, but was not the clothing of someone who had a role in the palace's operational life. And the not having a role quality was legible at close range in the specific way of things that were designed to pass at distance and couldn't sustain scrutiny. The third figure was in the palace security uniform, Brynn's own uniform, the specific unit designation on the shoulder that placed the figure in the night security rotation, not his section, but the rotation. He spent approximately half a second on the third figure. The third figure was the piece that made the picture coherent, because the external figure's presence in a restricted area at 3 in the morning required access. And access required the specific kind of help that a person in the night security rotation could provide. And the third figure's position in the room, slightly apart from the other two, slightly positioned toward the room's secondary exit. The position of someone who had brought something, and was maintaining the connection between the thing brought and the door through which it would leave if necessary, was the position of that kind of help. The picture was complete at 2 seconds. The senior court official said, in Varath and then immediately in Terran Standard, which told Brynn that the figure had assessed him in the same 2 seconds and had determined that Terran Standard was the more direct communication tool for the specific thing the figure was about to communicate. This room is in authorized use. You've taken a wrong turn. Resume your route. The voice was the voice of someone who was accustomed to instructions being followed, which was the voice of institutional authority at its functional level. The instruction was delivered with the quality of something expected to produce compliance. Not aggressive, not threatened, simply the straightforward delivery of a directive from someone who had reason to expect directives to produce compliance. Brynn registered the instruction and the quality of its delivery and the expectation behind it, and he registered the external figure's stillness, which was the stillness of someone who was calculating rather than reacting, and who was watching him with the specific attention of someone for whom his response to the instruction was the critical variable of the next 30 seconds. He registered the third figure's response to his entrance, which was the response that told him the most specific thing the room contained. The third figure had, in the 2 seconds of Brynn's entrance, moved from the slightly apart position to a position that was closer to the secondary exit. Not at it, not through it, but closer to it, which was the movement of someone for whom the secondary exit had just become more relevant. The movement was small and would have been invisible to someone who had not had the root in their legs and their attention in the room, but it was the movement of someone in the night security rotation who had, in the 2 seconds of Brynn's entrance, decided that their best option was the option closest to leaving. The picture was planned, specific night, specific room, external figure brought through restricted access by the third figure, Senior court official present with the institutional standing to frame the arrangement as authorized if challenged at the wrong level. Oriented towards something that required this room, this night, and the specific absence of the right people noticing. He did not know the target of the arrangement. He knew the quality of the arrangement, which was the quality of something that had been designed to happen without interruption, and he was the interruption. He decided what to do with that. He did not move further into the room. He took one step back, which put him at the door rather than through it, and he took the position at the door that he had been trained to take when the situation required controlling an entry point. Weight distributed, posture correct, presence in the room rather than on its threshold, which was the difference between a position that could be managed and a position that couldn't. The position was not aggressive. It was simply there, in the specific way of a thing that had established itself. He said, in the even register he had been taught for situations requiring de-escalation that was not actually de-escalation, but the appearance of it while the situation was being contained. I need everyone to remain in the room, please. The please was genuine rather than ironic. It was in his training and it was in his character, and it made no difference to the functional content of the instruction, which was that he was at the door and the door was the room's primary exit, and the room's primary exit was where he was. He activated the emergency signal at his wrist with the slight pressure of 2 fingers, which was the activation method that produced no visible or audible indicator at the point of activation. The signal went to the security center's monitoring system, and from there to the duty officer, who would dispatch the response. The response time was 4 minutes in the current staffing configuration, which he knew from the rotation's briefing materials. He had 4 minutes. The senior court official received his instruction with the expression of someone who had issued a directive and had received something other than compliance, which was an experience the expression suggested was unfamiliar. The official said, "You don't understand what you're involved in. This matter is significantly above your clearance level, and your appropriate response is to return to your route and forget this section of the corridor." Brynn said, "I understand I opened the wrong door and found a room that requires me to stay at the door until my senior staff arrives. I'm not making any determinations about what the room contains. I'm keeping the room contained until the people whose job it is to make those determinations get here." This was accurate. He was not making determinations about the political content of what he had found. He did not have sufficient context for the political content, and he understood this. What he was making determinations about was the situation's security quality, which was within his scope, and the security quality was 3 people in a restricted room at 3 in the morning, in an arrangement that had the quality of something planned and undisclosed, and one of the 3 in a palace security uniform who had moved toward the secondary exit when he entered. That quality was within his scope to respond to, which he was doing. The external figure had not spoken. The stillness that the external figure was maintaining was the stillness he had read initially as calculation, and in the minute since he had taken the door position, the calculation had resolved into something he was now reading as assessment. The figure was assessing him with the specific attention of someone who was determining whether he was the kind of person who could be worked around or the kind who couldn't. The attention was focused and was not hostile, and was not the attention of someone who was going to rush the door, which was the assessment he most needed and which the figure's quality was providing. He returned the figure's attention with the quality he brought to rooms that required it, which was the complete and settled attention of someone who was in the room and was going to remain in the room, and whose remaining in the room was not a performance but a fact. At the 2-minute mark, the 3rd figure, the one in the security uniform, said something. Not to Brynn, to the senior court official in Varath, at a volume that Brynn's commission standard language training followed at approximately 70% accuracy. The substance at 70% was, "This is finished. The person at the door is not going to move and the response team is coming and the arrangement is visible. The senior court official looked at the third figure with the expression of someone receiving information they had known was possible and had not wanted to receive. The third figure looked at Brynn and said, in Terran standard, with the quality of someone who has made a decision and is communicating it directly, "I'm going to sit down." Brynn said, "Please do." The third figure sat. The senior court official stood at the room's far end, in the position of someone who was working through the available options, and finding them fewer than they had been 3 minutes ago. The external figure had not moved from the window position and was still watching Brynn with the assessment attention, and Brynn was still at the door with the settled quality, and the room was in the specific state of a contained situation, which was the state where the situation had been determined, and the determining was now waiting for the resources to resolve it. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the third figure said, without being asked and without looking at the court official, "The arrangement was for tonight. The external figure has documentation of the matter that was being managed. The documentation was intended to be presented to specific parties without the governance record's knowledge." Brynn said nothing. He had not asked for this and was not going to manage it. It was not his to manage. It was his senior staff's, and beyond them the Queen's security apparatus, and his function was the door, and the door was what he was. The court official said in Varath, something that Brynn's 70% accuracy caught as, "You have no standing to." The third figure said in Varath, something that Brynn's 70% caught as, "I have standing that I am choosing," which is a different thing. At 4 minutes, the response team arrived. Sergeant Vel Oran was the first through the door, which was the correct first because the sergeant was the duty officer for the shift and the duty officer came first, and the sergeant took in the room in the specific 3 seconds of a senior security officer conducting a rapid assessment and said, to Brynn, "Status." Brynn said, 3 occupants contained. Secondary exit unchallenged. 1 occupant offered voluntary information regarding the arrangement's purpose. No physical incident. The sergeant looked at the 3 occupants, the senior court official, the external figure, the third figure in the security uniform, and at Brynn at the door and said, "Good, step out." He stepped out. 2 response team members stepped in. The door closed behind the response team and the sergeant stood with Brynn in the corridor outside the room and said, "Wrong door." Brynn said, "Wrong door." The sergeant said, "How long between entry and signal?" He said, 2 seconds to entry, approximately 2 to establish position, signal at position establishment. The sergeant said, 4 seconds total. He said, approximately. The sergeant looked at the closed door, then said, "Go complete your sweep." Standard log, deviation noted as wrong door entry, correction made, no further incident. The rest goes in a separate report to me personally when the sweep is done. He said, "Yes, Sergeant." He completed the sweep. The remaining sections took 6 minutes, which was faster than the standard time. And he noted the variation in the log and attributed it to the abbreviated Section 7, and continued to the sweep's conclusion, and sat in the security station's recording room, and wrote the separate report for Sergeant Vel Oran with the accuracy he brought to all reports, which was the accuracy of a complete account. In the sequence, the events had occurred without editorialization or framing beyond the facts. He wrote what he had seen and what he had done, and what the third figure had said voluntarily, and the sequence of the 4 minutes, and the response team's arrival and the handoff. He wrote it in 30 minutes and submitted it, and went to the night rotation's rest station, and did not sleep, which was understandable given the preceding 4 minutes. And he did not try to sleep because the specific quality of someone in the afterword of something significant was not the quality of someone who could sleep, and he had never been the kind of person who fought his own quality. He was called to the security chief's office at the 5th hour of the morning, which was 1 hour before the day rotation began. The security chief was a Varath named Debriefing Sorrel, who had held the position for 9 years, and who had the quality of 9 years of managing the palace's security apparatus. which was the quality of someone who had seen a significant range of situations and had learned to read new situations against the range, and who was, in reading this situation, reading it against a range that included situations Brynn did not have the context to imagine. The chief said, "Your account." Brynn gave it, the same account as the written report in verbal form, with the same accuracy and the same sequence and the same absence of editorialization. He gave it for 20 minutes, and the chief asked 7 questions, all of them precise and all of them aimed at specific elements of the 4 minutes that the chief was using to build a picture, and he answered all 7 with the same quality as the account. The chief said, "The third figure's voluntary statement." Brynn said, "I didn't ask for it and I didn't manage it. It was offered and I heard it and it's in the report exactly as I received it." The chief said, "You didn't ask because," he said, "because asking would have made me a party to the investigation rather than the initial containment, and the investigation is yours, not mine. My job was the door." The chief looked at him for a moment. Then, "Your route briefing covers the junction at Section 7 as a single-door junction." Brynn said, "Yes. The briefing doesn't reflect the actual junction geometry, which has 2 doors. I'll note the discrepancy in the route maintenance log." The chief said, "The right door leads to the administrative records corridor. The left door," Brynn said, "was not on the briefing. I've added it to my route map as a secondary access point for future sweeps." The chief said, "The briefing omission was not accidental. This was not a question." Brynn received it as a statement and held it for a moment and then said, "I understood that from the arrangement's quality, yes. The room being omitted from the route briefing was part of the arrangement's design." The chief said, "Which means your opening the wrong door was the specific event the arrangement's design was intended to prevent." Brynn said, "Yes. The arrangement required that door to not be in the sweep's scope. The briefing omission was the mechanism for keeping it out of scope." The chief said, "And you opened it by mistake?" He said, "Yes." The chief said nothing for a moment. Then, "The Queen will want to speak with you at the 7th hour." He said, "I expected that." He did not know if he had expected that. He said it because it was the most accurate answer to the most relevant question, which was whether he was prepared for the 7th hour, and saying "I expected that" was the most honest version of "I will be prepared for it," which was the substance of what the chief needed to know. At the 7th hour he was brought to a meeting room in the Queen's private section. Not the sealed meeting chamber, not the formal audience space, but a smaller room with the quality of a space used for conversations that were the point rather than for occasions that required a space. He had been in the palace for 3 weeks. He had been in this section of the palace never. Queen Sorvin was in the room. The security chief was in the room. He was in the room. She looked at him with the full Varath attentiveness that he had been told about in the commission's cultural orientation, and which, experienced directly, had the quality of being seen completely rather than assessed partially. Not the scanning look of a security sweep, but the complete look of someone who was in the room and was taking the room's complete account. She said, "Tell me what happened." He told her. He told her the same account he had given the security chief and the same account he had given the written report, and the telling was the same quality, accurate, complete in sequence, without editorialization. She received it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who had received information and was not rushing the processing. She said, "Why didn't you retreat when the court official told you to?" He said, "Because the instruction assumed I was going to make a determination about the room's political content, which I wasn't qualified to make. What I was qualified to make was a determination about the security situation, and the security situation was a room with an undisclosed external presence at 3 in the morning in a restricted area with a coordinating figure from the security rotation. That determination was in my scope, and the response to it was in my training." She said, "You could have withdrawn and reported it." He said, Withdrawing would have required the room to remain unsecured from the time of withdrawal to the time of the response team's arrival, which was a minimum of 4 minutes. An unsecured room with an undisclosed external presence and a coordinating figure from the security rotation, with 4 minutes unmonitored. I assessed that as a worse outcome than the door position. She said, "You assessed that in 2 seconds." He said, "I had the picture in 2 seconds. The rest was the response the picture indicated." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The arrangement's target was documentation of a governance matter that would have been presented to specific parties in the Empire's outer territories within the next 6 hours, before the governance record could be corrected. The presentation would have produced a territorial dispute that had been quietly managed for 3 years, and that is, in its managed form, stable, and that in its unmanaged form is the most significant governance crisis the Empire would have faced in this reign." He held this. He did not know the political dimensions and was not going to perform knowing them. He said, "I didn't have the context for what the room contained. I had the security quality of the arrangement." She said, "You had enough." He said, "I had what was in my scope. The rest was yours and the chief's." She was quiet again. The security chief was at the room's margin and was not writing, and was simply present in the room with the quality of someone who had been in the security chief's position for 9 years, and had watched this specific quality of conversation before, and was watching it again. She said, "The arrangement required your route briefing to omit the left door. The person who produced your route briefing was the third figure in the room." He said, "Yes. I identified that from the arrangement's design." She said, "The briefing was produced before you were assigned to the night rotation. The assignment was made 2 weeks before the arrangement's planned execution. The briefing omission was prepared 2 weeks in advance of the arrangement, which means the arrangement's designers anticipated a new rotation member would be assigned, and ensured the new member's briefing would not include the room." He said, "Yes. The design required someone who didn't know the junction had 2 doors." She said, "And yet you opened the left door." He said, "I misjudged the junction geometry in the dark. The 2 doors are nearly identical, and the junction lighting at 3 in the morning is below the daytime level, and I took the wrong one." She said, "The arrangement's entire architecture was designed to prevent the left door from being opened, and it was opened by a new rotation member taking the wrong door in dim lighting." He said, "Yes." She held his eyes. The full Varath attentiveness was present, and was carrying something now beyond the assessment quality. Something he did not have a complete category for, but which had the quality of someone who was looking at the intersection of a designed thing and the specific accident that had undone the design, and who was finding the intersection significant rather than simply fortunate. She said, "I want to be precise about something." He said, "Yes." She said, "The arrangement was sophisticated. It had been in preparation for 2 weeks, it had an internal security asset, it had institutional cover, and it had a specific operational window that closed at dawn. It was the kind of arrangement that succeeds when it is not interrupted, and it was designed specifically to not be interrupted." She said, "It was interrupted by a new soldier who opened the wrong door." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not a senior officer, not a strategic intervention, not a decision that anyone made deliberately to prevent what was being planned." He said, "I opened the wrong door, and there was something on the other side of it that needed someone to be at that door until the right people arrived." She said, "Yes, that's precisely what I mean." The room was quiet for a moment. She said, "The arrangement's designers spent 2 weeks building something that was going to work. They anticipated every variable they knew to anticipate. The variable they did not anticipate was the one they had specifically eliminated, the possibility of someone being at that door." He said, "They couldn't anticipate a wrong turn." She said, "No. They couldn't anticipate a wrong turn, and a wrong turn produced the only person who was going to be at that door, who had 4 seconds to decide what to do, and who did the thing the 4 seconds required." He said, The thing the 4 seconds required was in my training. I didn't do anything above my training. She looked at him. She said, the thing that was above your training was staying in the room after the court official told you to leave. The official has the institutional authority to make that instruction credible. And you had no protocol that covered a senior court official in an unscheduled room at 3 in the morning, telling a junior security specialist to resume his route. He said, I had the security quality of the arrangement. The official's authority was real, but the instruction to leave was in the direction of removing the containment, and removing the containment was the thing the security quality told me was wrong regardless of who was asking me to do it. She said, you trusted your assessment of the situation over the institutional authority of a senior court figure. He said, I trusted the 4 seconds and the picture they produced. The official's instruction was asking me to believe the picture was wrong and the picture wasn't wrong. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Brynn Vaes, security specialist 2nd class, 3 weeks in the night rotation. He said, yes. She said, you will be offered an advancement in your posting. The specifics will come through the security chief's office, and you will have the choice to accept or decline. Whatever you choose, your account of tonight will be entered in the palace's security record as a commendation.